After the Racketeering Influence and Corrupt Organizations Act, abbreviated as RICO, was passed in 1970, the next 2 decades saw a ton of high-level organized criminals in the U.S. tried, convicted, and imprisoned. The organized crime syndicates that had their origins in the Prohibition era never fully recovered. The trials of these high-level organized criminals in many ways exposed the Mafia's inner workings to the American public at large, and it was then that the American fascination with organized crime was revived. In the early 20th century, most Americans didn't live in the big eastern cities that were plagued by the gangs of newly arriving ethnic groups. Thus, most Americans had no real exposure to high-level organized crime. That all changed during Prohibition, when mob violence went into overdrive, and the previously unheard-of violence taking place due to mob warfare started making national headlines. With the help of a very willing American media and film industry, the Mafia was romanticized and turned into a brand of Americana throughout the 20th century. There were only a few gangster films prior to the Prohibition era. The gangster genre was largely defined after Prohibition, but even before then, a narrative was being set by the media and the film industries when it came to reporting on and depicting organized crime, and it was basically this. Organized crime was mostly an Italian, and sometimes an Irish thing. During Prohibition, the media had made figures like Al Capone famous for his role in the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and it carried over into film. The main character in the 1931 film Little Caesar was Rico Bandello, a crude caricature of an Italian gangster. Bandello was played by Edward Robinson, whose real name was Menashe Goldenberg, a Romanian Jewish immigrant. Goldenberg was later investigated as a communist during the 1950s. The film was distributed by Jacob Warner of Warner Brothers Studio and directed by Mervyn LeRoy, both of whom were of Jewish extraction. The 1931 film The Public Enemy was also distributed by the Jewish film studio Warner Brothers. It starred James Cagney as the Irish mobster Tom Powers. The film was produced by Daryl Zanuck, who is widely considered one of the progenitors of the tradition of sexual exploitation in Hollywood, which he fostered with his fellow executives Harry Cohn and later Harvey Weinstein. The 1932 film Scarface, The Shame of a Nation, was also inspired by Al Capone. It starred the Ukrainian Jew Paul Muni, born Mechilem Weissenfreund. Muni played an Italian gangster in Chicago named Tony Camonte. The screenplay was written by Ben Hecht, the son of Belarusian Jewish immigrants. The film was produced by the billionaire Howard Hughes and distributed by United Artists, which at the time was under the control of Joseph Schenck, a Russian Jewish immigrant. The 1938 film Angels with Dirty Faces follows the exact same formula as The Public Enemy. It was directed by the Jew Mano Kaminer. It was produced by the Jew Samuel Bischoff, and it was distributed by Warner Brothers. It starred James Cagney again as an Irish mobster. This is the movie that was the inspiration for Angels with Filthy Souls, the movie that the kid in Home Alone was watching and later used to fool and terrify various antagonists throughout the film. About a decade after Prohibition ended, the American gangster film lost popularity, but it persisted through American film in bits and pieces. You all probably remember the Looney Tunes characters Rocky and Muggsy, who appear in several cartoons throughout the 50s and 60s. Now, I love Looney Tunes in general, but again, it must be noted that it was produced, distributed, and voiced by Jews, who depict Rocky as a short little Italian mobster and Muggsy as his oafish Irish sidekick. The film Purple Gang was made in 1959, about the real-life Detroit-based street gang. The film was produced by the Jew Lindsley Parsons, whose real name was Leonard Berman. The film portrayed the Purple Gang as an Irish gang, when in fact the real-life Purple Gang was Jewish. As I mentioned earlier, the 1970s marked the revival of the gangster film genre, and at that point the narrative had already basically been set. Hollywood remained dominated by Jews, and while oftentimes Italian Americans took over the acting and directing duties, the films maintained the narrative set earlier by the Jewish film studios, which was that Italians and Irish are the ethnic groups responsible for American organized crime. The Godfather films, The Untouchables, Goodfellas, Donnie Brasco, Casino, Road to Perdition, The Departed, Kill the Irishman, The Sopranos, Boardwalk Empire, and Scorsese's The Irishman top the list of film media about the American Mafia. While there are some Jewish characters portrayed in these films, they are few and far between and tend to take a backseat role for Italian or Irish mob bosses. With the exception of perhaps Once Upon a Time in America and Bugsy, most of the films depicting Jewish involvement in organized crime are B-films that nobody has ever heard of. The former was an almost entirely Italian-American undertaking, perhaps to plead the case that it wasn't just Italians who were mobsters. But even so, the two Jewish main characters in Once Upon a Time in America are the minions of Irish and Italian crime bosses. And with Robert De Niro and James Wood playing the two Jewish main characters, one hardly remembers in hindsight that the main characters in the movie are Jews. The latter, the 1991 film Bugsy, is unique in that it was directed by a Jew, has Jewish main characters played by Jews, and portrays the Jewish main characters as mob kingpins instead of underlings. Bugsy received critical acclaim, but you'll rarely see mentions of it in anybody's list of top mob movies. When you really investigate the history of organized crime in the United States, it is more than just absurd that there are so few films and general knowledge about Jewish involvement in organized crime. As a whole, it's hard to deny that this conspicuous lack of representation is the result of anything else but a deliberate attempt by Jews in power to alter our perception of the ethnic character of American organized crime. When you ask an average American or Westerner what group they think of when they say the word Mafia, it's almost always the Italian organized crime group Cosa Nostra. And yet, certainly for a time, the Jewish role in organized crime in America arguably surpassed that of the Italians and certainly that of the Irish. The Jewish mob has alternately been called the Kosher Mafia, the Kosher Nostra, or Undzer Shtick, which translates to our thing, the Yiddish calque for the Italian Cosa Nostra. Undzer Shtick was created by a man named Arnold Rothstein, nicknamed the Brain. Rothstein was born into a wealthy Jewish family in Manhattan in 1882. His father was a respected businessman, and his brother was a rabbi. From a very young age, Arnold was a mammonist who was addicted to gambling. He became the owner of a casino and invested in a horse track by age 28, and was suspected of having fixed many races and sporting events, gaining national fame when he became the primary suspect of fixing the 1919 World Series. Rothstein was investigated and questioned by authorities about his involvement, but was never charged or convicted. During Prohibition, Rothstein consolidated and controlled the vast majority of Jewish street gangs in America, and as a result became one of the most powerful and wealthy criminals in the country, a key architect responsible for transforming American organized crime into a big business run like a corporation. Jewish historian Leo Katcher described Rothstein as, quote, the J.P. Morgan of the underworld, its banker and master of strategy, unquote. Rothstein used his connections with fellow Jews in finance, politics, law, and media to aid in his meteoric rise, and by 1925 he was the largest bootlegger and drug dealer in the United States. At the height of Prohibition, it is estimated that half of all bootlegging activities in the U.S. were carried out by Jews who were directly or indirectly under the control of Rothstein's crime syndicate. The Bugs and Meyer mob from New York's Lower East Side, which was founded by Jewish immigrants Benjamin Bugsy Siegel and Meyer Lansky, was among the most powerful of the gangs Rothstein consolidated and controlled, and thus when Rothstein was murdered in 1928, the business-savvy Meyer Lansky was the natural choice to become the head of Rothstein's organization. Siegel, who was a violent psychopath, was put in charge of Murder Incorporated, the aptly named enforcement wing of the Jewish Mafia. In 1929, Meyer Lansky got married and decided to honeymoon in Atlantic City. During his honeymoon, he also hosted what would eventually be known as the Atlantic City Conference, a historic summit between many of the major crime families in the U.S. at the time. At the conference, the delegates of Italian, Irish, and Jewish crime syndicates discussed the future of organized crime. Of the known 43 mobsters at the conference, 19 were Italian, 19 were Jewish, 4 were Irish, and only 1 was of founding Euro-American heritage. This was Enoch "Nucky" Johnson, the Atlantic City crime boss, depicted by actor Steve Buscemi in the show Boardwalk Empire. Some have speculated that the ethnic composition of the conference was not accurately representative of the overall ethnic composition of American organized crime as a whole, but the Jewish overrepresentation is still staggering, considering Italian and Irish Americans vastly outnumbered Jewish Americans at this time. At the time of the Atlantic City Conference, Undzer Shtick dominated large parts of New York, New Jersey, Philadelphia, Cleveland, Detroit, Boston, and Minneapolis. Other than Lansky and Siegel, Jews in attendance at the conference were Irving Wexler, aka Waxy Gordon, head of the Philadelphia branch of the Jewish mob, along with 5 of his closest Jewish associates. Louis Lepke Buchalter and Jacob Gura Shapiro, who controlled industrial labor racketeering in New York and established the hit squad Murder Inc., of which Lansky later put Siegel in charge. Arthur Simon Flegenheimer, aka Dutch Schultz, who controlled bootlegging in the Bronx and, some suspect, was the man who murdered Arnold Rothstein. Abner Longy Zvilman, known as the Al Capone of Jersey, who controlled bootlegging in North Jersey. Jake Greasy Thumb Gusick, the financial and legal advisor of Capone's Chicago outfit. Morris Moe Dalitz, boss of the so-called Little Jewish Navy that ran Cleveland, along with his top 2 Jewish associates. Bill and Abe Bernstein, 2 of the 4 Jewish sibling leaders of Detroit's predominantly Jewish Purple Gang. Charles King Solomon, the Jewish mob boss that controlled much of Boston and New England. After Prohibition, a number of the Jewish criminals present at the Atlantic City Conference turned their sights west and helped establish a transnational criminal empire that was mostly funded by income from casino investments in Las Vegas. Bugsy Siegel went out to Los Angeles and began working with Mickey Cohen, who took over LA after Bugsy was murdered by a sniper in Beverly Hills in 1947. During World War II and subsequently during the lead-up to the creation of the State of Israel, many Jewish criminals provided substantial donations to Zionist organizations. Jewish criminals aided Zionist agents from the Jewish Agency for Israel in orchestrating an illegal weapons procurement and smuggling operation that was based out of the port of New York. Once Israel obtained independence, Jewish gangsters such as Joseph Doc Stacher used Israel's law of return to flee criminal charges in the United States, knowing that the Israeli government would not extradite them. Meyer Lansky went on to be pivotal in the merger of Undzer Shtick with Cosa Nostra, establishing the National Crime Syndicate. He attempted to make Aliyah in 1971, but was reluctantly denied due to public scrutiny. Jewish criminals did and continued to play a key role in the unholy relationship between international politics and the criminal underworld. To this day, many of the world's most infamous criminals are Jews. Perhaps most notable among these are the Israeli drug kingpin Zev Rosenstein, as well as Semyon Mogilevich, who is the top boss of the Russian Mafia and was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list for his role in a $10 billion money laundering scheme in New York. Despite having massive power in the film industry, Jews rarely create films that expose the depth of the Jewish involvement in organized crime. Whenever Jews write about their tribesmen who were involved in organized crime, they will invariably mention how Jewish criminals were not religiously observant, and despite being evil and contributing to the degeneration of American society, the important thing to remember is that they were good to their fellow Jews. One book about Undzer Shtick is even called But He Was Good to His Mother, written by the Israeli professor Robert Rockaway. Leftist Jews especially revel in the stories about the violent attacks carried out by Jewish mobsters on German-American Bundist rallies during the 1930s, attacks which were often greenlit by Jewish politicians and judges who had no legal means of stopping the rallies, so they used criminals bound by their tribal allegiance. Jewish and non-Jewish writers alike often champion Jewish criminals for breaking the stereotype of the helpless Jew. In the book Tough Jews, Fathers, Sons, and Gangster Dreams, Rich Cohen wrote, quote, "If Jewish gangsters still thrive today, I think the Jewish community might be better off. After all, everyone needs someone who gives them the illusion of strength." Unquote. If you Google, "Why does nobody know about the Jewish Mafia?" a torrent of apologist articles written by Jewish outlets pop up. "Was there anything redeemable about Jewish gangsters?" one article is titled. Many journalists and authors openly champion how Jewish criminals collaborated with Zionist agents to illegally smuggle weapons out of the United States, evade the US-led blockade on Israel, and use American-made weapons to commit acts of terrorism on British forces in Mandatory Palestine. One article elaborating on the history of Jewish criminality is written by a Jewish law firm that specializes in assisting Jewish criminals with the process of making Aliyah and immigrating to Israel, an open appeal to the tradition of Jewish criminality. Another article attempts to lionize Jewish criminals by alleging they had a plan to go to Germany and assassinate Hitler, but the FBI stopped them. And so why do most Americans never think of Jews when they think Mafia or mobster? Well, the answer to that is rather obvious. Jews fund and control large swaths of the mechanisms that control public perception in the West: media, film, publishing, advertising, academia. And they use their control of those mechanisms to sanitize the evil and subversive actions of their fellow Jews in the eyes of the goyim masses. Their goal, as always, is to increase their own ethnocentric power and insulate themselves from all criticism by using any means necessary.
The valley voices are singing, bells are a ringing, dance, everyone dance, come to the valley, run through.